First item, which is apologies for absence and substitutions first.
Thank you, Councillor. We've received apologies from Councillor Bugby, for which Councillor Franks is substituting, Councillor Steve Davis, and Councillor Philip Wilson, for which Councillor Thorpe is substituting. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I'll move on to Chair's announcements. Before I do that, thank you all for coming in such a dreadful evening tonight. It's good to see everyone here. I think this is a reasonably important thing to deal with, so it's good to see you here. The first is, I have the announcements of the emergency evacuation procedures. In case of a fire, a bell will ring continuously. If this occurs, please leave the building immediately following the green fire exit signs out to the assembly point, which is by the War Memorial on Duke Street. If anyone requires assistance, please let me know. Lifts should not be used. Please remain at the assembly point and do not attempt to return to the building until you have been advised that it is safe to do so. Filming of this meeting. Anyone attending this meeting is entitled to film it, but only councillor officers and anyone sitting around these tables may be filmed. Members of the public should not be filmed, so please ensure cameras are pointed only in this direction. This meeting is also being broadcast via YouTube and recorded, I hope, because I think we had a problem at Cabinet. The meeting is being broadcast, as I've just said. Mobile phones, would you silence or switch off your mobile phones whilst the meeting is taking place? Thank you very much. Item 3, declarations of interest. All members are reminded that they must disclose any interest they know they have in terms of business of the meeting's agenda, and they must do so at this point on the agenda or as soon as they become aware of the interest. If the interest is a disclosable pecuniary interest, they are also obliged to notify the monitoring officer within 28 days of the meeting. Do any members have declarations of interest on any item on tonight's agenda? None were shown. Public question times. We've received no public questions. Number 5, decision called in. The item reports any decisions cabinets have called in. This evening we have one decision that's been called in, and it's obviously the main agenda tonight. And this is item 6, the Community Infrastructure Levy Governance Update call-in. We now move to item 6, the called-in decision relating to the governance update of the Community Infrastructure Levy, considered by Cabinet on the 27th of January 2026 and called in on the 30th of January. And I will now explain why that was called in and some other background that subsequently is on the papers, but which requires just a little bit more explanation. There is no evidence, this is the reason for the call-in, there is no evidence that the allocation of SIL monies was considered for the 3 adjacent parishes of Great Waltham, Broomfield and Drittle. When challenged at Cabinet, it was stated that the SIL policy did not allow for these areas to be included. It is believed that this interpretation is incorrect, and the call-in is to examine the rationale for the decision with reference to the policy which may result in additional areas being able to apply for this SIL funding. I also want to draw to your attention what's already in the papers, which I want to highlight, which is that the SIL Governance 3.5. It is very unlikely that SIL will generally generate enough funds to completely cover the cost of new infrastructure needed for fully support planned developments. As such, there will be competing demands for funding. It is therefore important to ensure there are robust, accountable and democratic structures in place to ensure the spending of SIL funds are prioritised in the right way. In line with that, I asked for further documents to be included in your pack. I asked for the website explaining the eligibility for SIL grants. I also asked for the minutes from the panel approving the applications detailed at Cabinet on 27th of the 1st, 26. Can I say that I was informed there were no minutes for the panel approving the applications? Included in this information who applied for the SIL grants and when the applications were made. I was informed these were all internal applications and they were approved by the Cabinet Minister, only one Cabinet member. I asked for the minutes of the Cabinet meeting to be adjusted to reflect the two very specific questions that were asked in relation to the process that had been followed, and was told that they were not verbatim and they were not able to adjust these to reflect the questions until obviously they go before Cabinet. So the minutes remain the same, although I know that those that asked the question will be able to reiterate those tonight. So we'll now proceed on to the call-in procedure number 3, and I will ask for the item B, the Cabinet member with the responsibility for the matter called in, to provide an explanation of the decision made at the Cabinet meeting on the 27th. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. I'm Councillor Rose Moore. I'm Cabinet Member for Greener Chelmsford, so have oversight of this area of the Council's work. I want to be absolutely clear that the call-in we are discussing today relates solely to neighbourhood SIL generated in the Chignals. That is the understanding I have of the challenge set out for overview and scrutiny according to the agenda. Neighbourhood SIL must, by law, be spent on infrastructure or on addressing the demands development places on an area. That is the fundamental test set out in the national SIL regulations. Suggestions that areas such as Great Waltham, Broomfield or Writtle may have been overlooked simply do not align with the purpose or the scope of the policy. This relates to the area close to Hollow Lane, where there was significant development that would impact most on the unparished area and closer to the city centre. I'm pleased to say that we have Mr. Stuart Graham with us today, who oversees SIL and is a specialist in that area. And I also want to indicate that it's relating to the national legislation as well as our own council policies that are created in the spirit of the national regulations. If you have questions or wish to look further at the community infrastructure bids themselves, that is a separate issue, not within my portfolio, but my colleague, Councillor Natasha Dudley, will be very pleased to, again, to explain the choice of awards of funding for those projects. I have finished. Sorry, Chair. You were writing, and I didn't want to interrupt if you were writing.
No, I thought there was more. That was all. Sorry. In that case, we'll... do we want to... Stuart, did you want to say anything on this?
If I could just add a couple of procedural matters in terms of the policy approach. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Stuart Graham. I'm the Economic Development and Implementation Services Manager, and I've had the pleasure of managing SIL since we adopted it in 2014 at the City Council. So just in terms of the policy, just to reiterate a couple of things that Councillor Moore has said. So the policy that we're considering tonight, presented in item 9.1 of Cabinet on the 27th of January, was drafted to reflect all scenarios, potential future scenarios, not just the Chignal scenario that in effect is what we're discussing tonight. A key element of that policy is to enable the City Council to use the money effectively on city council-led capital projects to make best uses of our resources. And as Councillor Moore has said, the policy needs to be read in conjunction with the national policy in terms of how the neighbourhood SIL portion should be spent. In other words, addressing the demands that development places on an area. And I'll just equate that to how you might consider a local plan policy. You read a local policy and you'll always read it alongside national policy. And that's how the SIL policy that we're discussing tonight should be read alongside that national policy.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else that you want to speak on this? Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Could I, as Councillor Moore said, this is really about a very, very small part of the policy, and it's summarised at the bottom of page 23 of the agenda pack and top of page 25, paragraphs 14, 15 and 16. Paragraph 14 explains that the policy was adopted by the previous administration in 2018 and this policy is still in place. 15 says a bit more about it and specifically quotes paragraph 3.5 of the policy. Neighbourhoods which are invited to express an interest for the surplus SIL money can include parish councils and non-parish neighbourhood groups, but only for projects in the vicinity of the development in which the SIL money was originally collected. So as Councillor Moore said, it's not an exclusion of explicitly excluding the areas mentioned, it's just that they're not proximate to where the SIL money is originally collected. And then paragraph 16, this policy approach has not generated sufficient range of suitable and deliverable projects in that neighbourhood, and so there is an unallocated balance. And the purpose of the Cabinet decision was to allow the City Council to spend that money on its own projects in that neighbourhood, instead of just relying on the parish councils and non-parish neighbourhood groups in that area to apply. So it's actually, all it's doing is increasing the number of projects that would be eligible.
Thank you. I take it that nobody else wishes to speak. Councillor Dudley, no. Councillor Steele.
So are we moving to questions now, Madam Chair? Thank you. Right, I've got a few questions, I'm sure you're aware. And I am sticking purely to the uncapped SIL from Chignall and the policy around that. And it was a question I asked in Cabinet, and I think, Councillor Moore, you've just confirmed. The first question was going to be, could you, as we haven't got a record of the meeting, could you confirm the answer to my question, which I think my question was, can we make a bid for this SIL from Great Waltham Parish, or can they make a bid for it? And I was, the response from Councillor Robinson was, no, that's not what it's meant for, or something similar to that. And I think, just as point one, I think you've confirmed what was said as being correct. That's what he said, yeah? Okay, I'll take that as a read. Therefore, I'm now going to go on to what it actually says in the policy. And it says, identified capital projects in the wards that immediately adjoin the parish where the development has taken place within the parish itself or within a ward or parish impacted by the development from which the SIL receipts arose. It uses the words or, doesn't say and, okay? So actually, I think it's badly worded, the policy, personally, because I think you meant adjacent and impacted, but you actually say adjacent or impacted. So it could be used at the other side of Chelmsford if there is an impact. Do you agree? Did you mean it to say impacted and adjacent, or did you mean it to say impacted or adjacent? Because you can meet, if you meet one of those criteria, you can go on the list. And I've got more questions beyond that.
Shall I answer that one first as best I can? I read the policy against the national guidance as well. And whilst we could sit here and discuss the wording and whether it's particularly strong. I think it is strong enough, and bear in mind that this policy is written to apply to other parishes or other areas. So if I give an example, so just bear with me, forget Chignall for the time being. You could have a development, and we have got some, that's right in the corner of a parish, quite a few houses being built, and it might come very close to the sill cap, and it might border a number of other parish areas. And if it breached the sill cap, you might look to adjacent parishes to address the demands that development has placed on that area. So a play area, for example, could be very close in another parish. The example we're talking about here, Great Waltham, Broomfield and Writtle, I think when you read the SIL national policy, address the demands that development places on an area, I wouldn't interpret that to mean the intent of the national policy or our local policies to spend that SIL on whatever it might be, play areas, community centres, 2 or 3 miles away from the development.
Okay, but I'm not querying the national policy. I'm querying the words used here. It's got 2 criteria, impacted or adjacent. Great Waltham, Broomfield, Writtle are adjacent, so they qualify. Even if not impacted, they qualify according to the words written in your policy. Is that not correct?
That's not the intention.
Thank you for the clarification. If that's not the intention, I've got another series of some more questions then. Go on.
Carry on, Councillor Robinson.
I think I addressed that because I knew this was the point, the key point. I think I addressed that in what I just read out. 3.5, which is on the top of page 24 of the agenda. Neighbourhoods which are invited to express an interest for the surplus SIL monies can include both parish councils and the non-parish neighbourhood groups. However, bids can only be made for projects which are in the vicinity of the development in which the SIL money was originally collected. So what I actually said at Cabinet was, I didn't think you could be stopped, Broomfield or the Great Waltham could be stopped from applying, but I didn't think those applications would meet those criteria. Okay,
thanks for the clarification. I read the words 3.5, I don't have a problem with those. I have a problem which was in 1.8 of the Cabinet meeting, which had the words or in it. So, but let's move on, because you've clarified it's got to be in the vicinity and it's got to be impacted. And then I think there's 5 projects listed in the list of projects that were in the Cabinet meeting, and 4 of them qualified for capped CIL usage, and they were CSAC Air Conditioning Studio, CSAC, I think the aircon for the officers was rejected, Safer Space for Girls, it was Melbourne Park, Melbourne Sports Ground Maintenance, and City Centre Cycle Racks, specifically Tower Gardens. I accept that they are adjacent and in the vicinity, and those were the ones where the CIL from, the cap CIL from Chignall was used. I suspect, therefore, the logic is people at the new Chignall estate would use CSAC, could use CSAC. And I assume that's your justification. But there are many other cases in the adjacent parishes, not in the centre, where people are living in little hollows, have moved in there, could use their facilities. Prime example would be, I would expect any teenagers to go to CVHS in Broomfield. So, and I've got other examples. There may be parents who take their children to school in Great Waltham Primary School. Residents who live in Little Hollows will get to the A414 by driving down Ongar Road in Writtle. So there are direct impacts in the adjacent parishes, not just the centre. What I am curious about, what I'm disappointed, is that in all those considerations for use of the capped neighbourhood SIL, there appears to be no consideration of any of those things that would have a direct impact on the adjacent parishes, and any requests made to the parish councils as to whether they could receive CIL funds. So I'm putting that there is a case for adjacent parishes with facilities used by people on the new estate, just as much as it's used in Seasack and Melbourne Park. Why weren't they considered as well? Have you any evidence of those being considered?
Stuart?
So we're morphing 9.1 and 10.1 from Cabinet in the discussion here. So I'll explain how the projects in 10.1 were arrived at, if that's okay, because that might help the committee. So the starting point for the 10 projects that are set out in item 10.1 that went to Cabinet are that they are a set of projects, City Council capital projects, that were aligned with the capital programme process starting last summer, and we went across all the service managers to identify projects that could either be funded through the capital programme or alternative funding. But importantly, they are within the 9 unparished wards. So through that process, a project beyond the 9 unparished wards, even if there was one, wouldn't have made it into that list, because that was item 10.1 was considering the allocation of SIL funding in the 9 unparished wards. In going through that process, and as I'm sure you agree, prudential financial management is important given the council's financial position. We identified that it's possible to fund some of those projects using a mix of funding, and that's how most projects are funded. They're not normally 106 SIL capital programme. You normally fund them through a mix of funding. So we identified at that stage, with the list of projects that came forward across the organisation, that we identified some Section 106 funding that could be used, and we identified some SIL cap funding that could be used. And it was just 2 items that the SIL cap funding was identified for. The works at Melbourne Park for grounds maintenance, and also the Safer Places for Girls project. So there were only 2. So in identifying a range of funding that could deliver all of those projects, which to me is good news, because usually we're oversubscribed with funding bids, we identified a range of funding as described. That required a change to the policy, which was set out in item 9.1, to enable us to spend the SIL cap on City Council capital projects. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. So you say it was 2, but I looked down the list. I think 5 of them asked the question: does it qualify? Does the Chignal SIL qualify? I think, and the answer, one was answered no, and one was answered. 5 were answered yes, if I remember that. But I haven't got. But that's not the point, because actually I am not querying the justification for the projects that were chosen. I mean, actually, I use some of the things that are in that list, right? I'm not querying that justification of what was chosen. I'm querying why you didn't consider other projects outside the unparished area, in the adjacent parishes. I know there are projects I'll take Great Waltham because it's my parish, where they're renewing all the play equipment, and they've written to me and said, is there any funds available to help us with that new equipment? I know the schools in Broomfield and Writtle could do with extra cash and they may well be impacted by this new development. So the question isn't justifying what you did choose, it's why you didn't consider projects in the adjacent parishes, because it looks strange that only the unparished areas won out here. And after all, the centre does get 85% of the sill. We're talking about neighbourhood sill, which is kind of really pointed at parishes, and it's gone to the centre. So I want to know specifically, was there a process, and is there any evidence of considering projects in the parishes that are impacted?
Councillor Robinson.
My mind is blown, Councillor Steele. Mr Graham has just explained at great length that the projects that were agreed were about spending sill, unparished area sill, in the unparished area. That's the definition of policy compliance. Money arising from the unparished area was spent in the unparished area. You can't spend money from the unparished area in the parished area, which is what you just said in your last sentence. No, but most... You're doing it again. You're confusing the two items on the agenda. You're confusing what we spent on item 10, which was applying an existing policy which has not been changed, with item 9, which was changing the policy for future spending. And if Chelmsford Valley High School wants to apply for some of that, they can do.
Sorry, all right, I apologise, I'm confused. Where did the 160k, or where is the 160k uncapped sill from Chignell going to be spent?
We don't know, because we haven't had the applications yet. We're waiting for it. We've
So
just
that
changed
wasn't in 10.1, that list in
No.
10.1? Okay, so you will consider projects from the parishes for that 160k? Because I saw the question in 10.1 where it asked, does it apply? There is definitely in 10.1 a question, does the uncapped sill apply? Is that correct? There is that question asked. I mean, I'll bring up the agenda if I have to.
Unless it's a city council capital project under the terms of the new policy.
Sorry,
Unless it's a city council capital project under the new policy, if adopted, then applications from the parish, unless it was a project that the city council had control of, for example, if it was a play area that we managed, then it wouldn't be applicable. And I would also, again, apologies, I'm going to go back to the National Seal Guidance says the spend of, forget boundaries, forget sums of money, should be spent on addressing the demands that development places on an area. If you look at the Hollow Lane development, I personally think it's a stretch to think it's appropriate to spend that 2 or 3 miles away. There's nothing stopping us doing that if we chose to, but the policy is about city council capital projects.
forgive me, I do need to bring up, I'm looking at the cabinet the cabinet agenda, and I need to find 10.1, and I read those as being, you asked the question, could the uncapped Chignell sill be spent on this project? And the answer was yes. Have I misread that? What did that mean then? If it could, did that not mean that's where the uncapped sill was being spent?
Could I just ask which part are you looking at? Item 10.1?
I think it was it the cabinet agenda 10.1, wasn't it? I'll have to find it. Though I didn't think that was in dispute. I would have been prepared more with it.
Councillor Steele, I think you're referring to table 1 in 10.1.
Yeah, it was in the table.
Which sets out each of the projects, what the SIL funding request is, where we've identified other funding, whether that's 106 or the SIL cap.
It was page 170 onwards, and for example, it says air conditioning Studio 1, project cost 17k. At the bottom, in the Chignell cap area, ? Yes. What does that mean then?
That is applying the 2018 policy, which is talking about in the vicinity of the development, i.e. the adjacent wards.
Does that not mean there is Chignell sill capped being used fund that project then?
Yes, it does. Yes.
It does mean
Yes.
that then? Oh, so I'm not confusing it then?
The paper says, is it in the area? Yes or no? Because if the project is proximate to Hollow Lane, then it's eligible. So
So the
in the
CAP
previous
CIL is
council-
being spent there then?
some of it has been.
Yes, so it is.
For
yeah.
example, so to give two other examples, on the previously, I worked with former Councillor Holloway before 2019 when the first lot of SIL cap money came in, because it comes in stages. SIL doesn't all come in one go, it comes in 3 stages during the development. And the first round of SIL cap money that came in was quite small because there were only 148 because it's the first phase, and we spent money just on the Chignal, right on the boundary between the Chignal parish and Chelmsford, the trees that are on the corner of Copperfield Road and Chignal Road. And we also agreed to spend some money on St Andrew's Scouts, which is 100 metres down the road. So that's 2 examples of where the SIL cap money was spent just either side of the Chignal's parish boundary, but both within half a mile of the Hollow Lane.
But that is the SIL cap money from Chignal that they didn't get because of the cap,
Yeah.
and none of it's been considered for the other adjacent parishes or any of their projects then.
They didn't apply. That's why we've widened the policy.
They didn't apply, okay. Were they asked to apply?
Well, it's been policy since 2018, so they would have been asked a couple of times since then. But,
I don't recall, I'll switch into parish councillor mode, but I don't recall, as a parish councillor of Great Waltham, being told that there was capped CIL in the adjacent ward of Chignal, and did Great Waltham have any needs that they thought were appropriate?
But Great Waltham wouldn't have been asked because the 2018 policy, the bid in bold at 3.5, bids can only be made for projects which are in the vicinity of the development.
Well, it's not Great Waltham adjacent and in the vicinity.
I wouldn't describe Great Waltham as in the vicinity of the Hollow Lane urban extension of North West Chelmsford, no.
Okay, well, I think the words adjacent were used in 1.8, but was it immediately adjoined? The words adjoin was in your 1.8, so it didn't say the vicinity.
Councillor Seal,
Maybe that needs clarification.
This was your policy. Your policy.
Not
that
my
your
policy.
Party, your party.
I'm not the cabinet member.
No, but
Councillor.
your party put in place in 2018.
Yeah, but you
should have known about it. And so why didn't? If you knew about it and you were unhappy with the policy, you could have changed it.
Because I'm just questioning what I was told in the cabinet meeting, which was the 160k was not available to adjacent or adjoining wards, which is what the policy says that was being presented at that cabinet meeting.
Councillor Thorpe-Apps.
Thank you, Chair. So obviously this evening we're talking about the surplus neighbourhood allocation. I think you said in your comments, the officer said in the comments that this is very much down to the SIL regulations. Could you actually set out how much discretion the council has in allocating specifically the surplus neighbourhood allocation? Because my understanding was that actually the council has quite strong discretion in this particular area.
That's correct. We have, Mr. Butcher might want to correct me on a legal point, but we have total discretion on the SIL cap, if I can call it that. In fact, the original policy allowed us just to not even go through this process of trying to find local projects to benefit. We could have just absorbed it back into the strategic pot. So the regs are silent on what you can do with it. So yes, we do have discretion.
Thank you. And do the regs, do they define vicinity? When we talk about vicinity, is there actually a definition in the regulations?
Not that I'm aware of. But I look at the definition that says addresses the demand the development places on an area. And I know that can be direct, indirect. Some people might think it's 3 miles away. Other people might think it's much closer to the development.
Thank you. So it is open to interpretation in vicinity. So in terms of geographical distance, it's open to interpretation. So when Councillor Steele referenced possible application to projects in Great Waltham, it is down to interpretation.
Yes, because the regs are silent on it. Therefore, we can interpret it how we choose to as the charging authority.
Thank you. And our policy doesn't our policy doesn't define vicinity either, does it? I didn't see that there was any definition of vicinity in there. Also, in terms of the word impacted, so with the amended policy that went to Cabinet, we have this description of impacted. So we're talking about projects in the parish, in the neighbouring wards, or projects where there's an impact. Is there any definition of impacted? I don't think there's a definition specifically of impacted in the SIL regulations either.
No, there's no definition, but I think with SIL you have to apply some logic and interpret policy and apply logic.
Sure.
If you have an urban extension of 258 houses on the edge of a city, the greater impact, I'm not saying there's not an impact on adjacent parishes, but the greater impact is on the adjacent urban area. The people that live in those houses probably, I haven't got the data, but they probably go to their GPs in the urban area, their kids probably go to sports facilities in the urban area, much closer than perhaps more remote villages would be. So I suppose I'm interpreting, we've interpreted the policy and applied some logic to it.
Okay, thank you. So at Appendix 3, which is in these papers and obviously was produced after the Cabinet decision, it says in there, I think it's section 19, just a clarification perhaps on this point, it talks about, what was it? Sorry, just find my place. Yeah, sorry, here it is. It says the principal change was to enable the City Council to determine spend against its capital programme. It's not a process against which parish councils or neighbourhood groups could bid or apply to. So this is the main change compared to the old policy. So the old policy, it's this word vicinity, so local groups, parishes in the vicinity could apply, but under the policy change, that's not the case. So it's basically the City Council saying these are the projects that we consider. It has to be capital projects. When the paper came to Cabinet, I didn't really get a sense that was set out very clearly, because that's quite a fundamental change, isn't it? So not only are we changing the geographical scope of the application, we're also changing the fact that local groups can no longer bring a project. And now this is effectively a centralised decision. So I suppose my question is, so given that we're looking at the decision from the Cabinet and whether that can be questioned in any way, whether the Cabinet had all the information at hand, I suppose my question is, potentially should Cabinet have been given more information about that? Because that's quite a fundamental change to the policy. Appreciate that may not be a question for you, I'm not sure, but...
Does Councillor Robinson want to answer that question, or?
I didn't know it was directed at me.
Well, it wasn't directly, but I think that there was a need to answer a question where there was a significant change that wasn't well understood at Cabinet.
I'll let Mr Graham come in and then follow up if I need to.
I think if you read item 10.1 and item 9.1 together, I think it's relatively clear within those two reports to Cabinet that the change being made, the change to spend the money on CCC capital projects, was all about financial prudence. and using the funding mix in the best way to deliver some really good community infrastructure improvements.
Yes, but I suppose specifically on the point about local groups being able to bring, and I think it's an expression of interest, that's what could formally be brought within the vicinity. So that's no longer possible going forward with the new policy. But I suppose it's quite a specific point really about whether that information was provided to Cabinet. I can't see, because hopefully we've got the Cabinet paper here in the pack, I can't see that was actually specifically described. It does talk about City Council Cabinet projects, but it doesn't say that local groups can't bring expressions of interest.
You're correct, it's not explicitly in there.
I think Mr Brooks wants to add to this.
Yeah, just on that point, paragraph 1.7 of the Cabinet report clearly sets out that the process that was in place that allowed parishes, non-parish neighbourhood groups in the vicinity of the development to submit an expression of interest hadn't generated enough applications, which is why the policy was being proposed in that Cabinet report to change. So I think the information is in there quite clearly set out.
Okay, thank you for that. I had another point about the new policy. So one of the criteria, so we've got the criteria, so we say projects in the parish, neighbouring wards, and if there's an impact. It's perhaps a minor point, but it doesn't actually, as I read it, refer to the actual ward that the development is in. So if it's Chelmsford Rural West, projects, potentially it's more difficult for a project there, which seems odd given that the development is in the ward. So I just wondered, I don't know if we have the ability to request amendments here, but maybe it should say the wards that the development was in as well. Again, I don't know who I'm asking that question to, really.
Are you referring to which bullet are you referring to, Councillor Rapp?
Sorry, in the new policy,
yeah.
So it's the new criteria. Here it is, sorry, I found it. So where we say the SIL cap balance can only be spent on identified projects in wards that adjoin the parish, immediately adjoin the parish, where development has taken place, within the parish itself or within a ward or parish impacted by the development. So, arguably it would be a ward, I suppose, that was impacted by the developments, but it just seemed odd to me that that it doesn't say the wards that the development took place in. Because I would have thought Chelmsford Rural West in this instance should have more of a priority.
I think when you look at any policy wording, you can always perhaps slightly improve it.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah.
All I'd say on the policy is there's 4 parts to it, and again, it needs to be read alongside what the SIL regulations say, and I would say the SIL regulations override local policy. And I just, if I may, because it hasn't been brought up yet, and I don't want to miss the opportunity, but we've been talking about parishes spending money. So parishes do get their SIL neighbourhood allocation, and it's in Appendix 3, right at the end. Broomfield has had 350,000 of neighbourhood SIL. Chigwell's had 124,000 of neighbourhood SIL. Great Waltham 39,000 and Writtle 78,000. So if there were demands that any of those parishes felt that this development were placing on their areas, they, under the same national policy that we're applying in our policy, the parish councils could be spending that money on community infrastructure improvements.
Councillor Seal.
I think I'm even more confused in the cabinet meeting now. The new policy, as set out in 9.1, and Councillor Thorpe perhaps has just read it out, part of it, says very clearly, doesn't talk about vicinity, it says very clearly that the capped money can be spent in capital projects in the wards that immediately adjoin the parish where the development has taken place, within the parish itself or within the ward or parish impacted by the development, etc. Is that the new policy, or is it still within the vicinity and impacted? If this is the policy, I haven't seen any evidence of anything other than the adjoining unparished areas being considered. And I hear what you say about the local parishes getting CIL, but it's different according to how much building they've got. I don't see any evidence of that capped amount being available to the adjoining parishes if they consider they have developed. And I think, if nothing else, this policy needs clarifying. Are those words correct as written, or do you want to change them? And whatever they change to, I'd like to see evidence that it's being complied with.
Can I have a go again?
Councillor.
I know I think we're going round in circles on this. As Mr. Graham said a couple of minutes ago, the primacy of the national regulation is the thing that trumps everything. If I can use that one, overrides everything else. So, if challenged, if we took legal advice, we'd have to say that we're abiding by the national regulation, whatever the policy says. And the national regulation is what's interpreted in the 2018 policy, which is in the vicinity of the development. And I regret now that we talked about wards, parishes and adjacent, because in the vicinity, for me, I think would be sufficient, but that is what's in the national regulation, and I think we've over-interpreted. What is very clear is that we're talking about £110,000 that will arising in neighbourhood CIL. That's not a great deal of money. Writtle Parish Council will get £2.2 million in neighbourhood CIL when Warren Farm is built. Most of those houses will have an impact on my ward and not an impact, but maybe not quite substantial impact on the rest of the parish of Writtle. Will my ward be able to benefit from any of that 2.2 million? No, it won't, because it will all be given to Writtle Parish Council. So I think we're just talking about £110,000 to be spent in the vicinity of Hollow Lane. And I hope we can come up with some projects that are worthwhile for that money within the vicinity.
Can I just interrupt that? It's not about the money, it's about the principle, about whether policy is clear and how people understand that. And I think that's what the debate has been about. We had an item at Cabinet which has clearly not been fully understood. There is ambiguity, and if the policy, the national policy trumps all, it should be reflected more accurately in the policy that we are signing off. Because it's no good having a policy that then has to be altered by reference to another document. It should stand alone and be cognizant of it, but also include in that what is required. And I think that's the issue here. It's about £100,000 is actually quite a lot of money, and it is about the principle. And there are certain things in this process which haven't been particularly satisfactory. For example, having the referral to the panel that should consider applications that hasn't actually got minutes, so that we know what considerations and how those decisions about a lot of money has been come to. So there are various things that are in this I think we need to unpick. And this isn't an attack on anyone. This is about understanding a policy that will be referred to in the future. And I think just from what's been said from one side of the room, and certainly my understanding at Cabinet, I am more confused than ever now by sitting here and listening to what's been said than I was before we started. So I've said enough, but I just want to make the point, this is about a process that is going to stand the test of time. It needs to be understood by everybody, not just the people who write it. It's got to be understood by everyone. Are there any other questions?
Can I just make a point about the community funding panel? Constitutionally, it is not regarded as a decision-making body, therefore minutes are not required. It refers it refers its decisions to be taken at Cabinet. Now, you may find that splitting hairs, but that is why there are no official minutes. However, if it is the view of this meeting that going forward that meeting should be minuted, I'm sure that can be done. It's not some kind of secret cabal stealing community money or anything like that at all. It's just literally the wording of the Constitution, because it's not considered to be a decision-making body. We don't have it minuted.
I wasn't suggesting it was underhand, but what you haven't got is an audit trail as to why they've made recommendations or not. And I would assume that once they've gone through and they've sieved out what has been applied for, they then push forward the ones that they recommend. Is that correct or not?
There tends to be a sort of grid of decision of criteria for each bid, particularly not so much. It has been quite difficult with this one because we've got the national legislation where discussions arise on the panel. It tends to be for community funding bids for discretionary funding, because unfortunately we always have a very limited amount of funding for the bids, and we have far more applications than we have money, and it's the ones that are just on the border that generate quite a lot of debate.
Councillor Highlands, I'm going to allow you to speak because I've allowed Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. Just on that point of community funding, because I looked at the paperwork around that, and that body is made up of Cabinet members making decisions or referencing to the Cabinet. So it's full of Cabinet members giving a recommendation to a Cabinet body, and there are officers in there. There are no other parties in that group, as I understand it from the paperwork.
That's not correct. We do have Lorraine Jarvis from the CVS who comes along because they know all the local charities. So she's also on the panel. It's not exclusively council officers.
I got it, but the point I'm trying to make is Cabinet members offering recommendations to Cabinet members with no overview or scrutiny from anybody, because there's no minutes or recording of the discussion in that point, which I think was the point that the Chair was making as well.
I have joined a committee which has functioned like that under our administration, and I'm assuming it functioned like that under previous administration, since it's a constitutional point. I don't know. I've only been here since 2019.
Stuart, do you want to comment on that?
It used to be called the SIL Spending Panel. Did pretty much the same thing, but yes, you're right. If this helps, just the Community Funding Panel, when it considered these projects back in November, there were no additional projects. In effect, the information that was reported to Cabinet was the information that was considered by the Community Funding Panel. And as officers, we take the panel through the projects and align them to the SIL, again, the SIL regs and the corporate plan and strategy.
I think I understand that, but I think you referred earlier to the fact that since 2018, the question's been asked twice, and you wonder how much people in the community know what is available. Just a comment. And when we talk about what's happened before and what regime did what, that's not what this is about. It's about scrutinising something that's going on, scrutinising a change and saying, can we make it better? Can we make it more transparent for the public? And this is money that is going to be used in communities. The whole purpose of that was to assist both the council to provide good services and make good choices, but it does need to be transparent so people know that it's fair. And if they don't see that, I'm not suggesting at all there's anything underhand, but it can look that way because suddenly decisions are made and nobody knows anything about it. That's the way it looks. Is there anybody else that's got any questions? Councillor Franks.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, just on some of the wider points earlier, I think the policy does make it clear that the overriding principle is that should we spend money in areas that are most affected by development, and I think we can all agree that is the answer to that is yes. Though Councillor Whitehead isn't here, I'm sure that if we should spend a large proportion of money on a hypothetical development in the southern part of Stock Parish, for example, in Goat Hall Ward, he would object profusely. Ultimately, the item was brought to discuss the potential of spending money from the Hollow Lane development, a development that is expressly an extension of the urban area. And I honestly can't see how it could be argued that a resident in Great Waltham is considerably affected by a development where residents live and work in the urban community. But I'm sure if Councillor Steele can, that the Cabinet would be happy to hear from him any proposals that he's got.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Oh, that wasn't really a question, was it? It was, perhaps you need to sit over there. It was a defence. I'll give you one example. Where do the teenagers from the new development go to school? They go to CVHS, which is in the adjacent parish. That's a prime example. How can you deny that?
I didn't. I agree. I agreed with that earlier. I think it would be really helpful if we did actually just concentrate on what decision you called in, because when you asked for all these additional bits and pieces, that was referring to the second item on the agenda, on the Cabinet agenda, and a lot of what's been said this evening is confusing the two issues. I am very happy if we go away, if we need to clarify the wording so that there is no confusion. But I'm very happy with Mr. Graham's explanation that the regulations are clear enough. But you'll have your chance on the future, because this is about setting policy for the future, to question any decisions which come forward and say that that's not eligible or it is eligible. So if it needs clarification, then we can do that. But I don't think it does, because I think the bit that I read out nearly an hour ago is the key one, which is that it's all about the impact of development in the vicinity. If we need to update our own policy, then we can look at that. But I don't think we need to, because I think in the vicinity, and whilst we've been talking, I've been Google searching what in the vicinity means, and I think, you know, we could all, I think, as I said at Cabinet, I think it would be difficult to justify, but maybe not impossible. So if you want to work with me as the adjacent county member on, for instance, the cycle path that would benefit children who live in Hollow Lane, I'm happy to talk to you about that, because that is something which I think would benefit the children who cycle to Chelmsford Valley High School, because unfortunately the County Council didn't finish the job properly from the previous, what would it called? I forgot what it's called, the congestion busting measures. They ran out of money to finish the cycle path on School Lane, and so maybe we could look at spending some money on that, for example, because that would be of benefit to the children who are cycling to Chelmsford Valley.
Without going into the detail of what we might spend in the future or now, I think Councillor Thompson, you had a question.
Yes, so, I mean, this evening there have been elements of confusion going on and elements of circularity, I feel, and yeah, this is just an expression of opinion, really, and also, obviously, people are still trying to understand where SIL is spent and why, and I just, I welcome the debate, but I just wonder whether an informed debate for this sort of thing in future might be another way of addressing it, because obviously people do need to be informed and they do need that clarity. Obviously, you've got an absolute right to call in what you want to do, but I just wonder whether, to say we're ignorant is too strong a word, but I just wonder whether a bit of an informed debate on that might have been another way of addressing this evening. But just a thought.
Councillor Hyland.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's one of the key points that were brought out in the review of how we do things, that overview and scrutiny should be a place that policy is brought to be over-reviewed and scrutinised prior a decision, not post a decision. This seems to be the cart before the horse in that respect. So I think we should be strongly looking at changing the way a policy is being brought forward, something like this, that it is pre-scrutinised before a decision is given by Cabinet. Just coming, whilst I have the microphone, I just wanted to bring the debate back to the word area being used. So SIL is supposed to support development of its area. And if you look at page 17 of the pack, number 3.1, it talks about SIL is a pool into one fund, which can be used for any infrastructure need to support new development across the council's administrative area, not a parish council's area, the city council's area. And it goes on to say in 3.2, SIL spending does not need to directly relate to donor development. So where the development takes place is almost irrelevant, apart from the 15% that you put there, or the 25%, depending if they've got a plan at that parish level. It's a pool of funding for the area of Chelmsford. So we have to be very, very clear in any documentation that we've got that this wording is not misinterpreted, or should I say, is not misused to send us along a path that narrows down a policy when you're trying to ensure that it's covering a broad spectrum of need for the whole city area, not just for areas within the centre that might be.
Thank you, Councillor Highlands. I think Stuart and then Councillor Steele again. Stuart, do you want to?
At the risk of expanding the debate into a full-blown discussion around SIL, I think, Councillor Highland, you're referring to the strategic allocation of SIL, which is pooled. Neighbourhood SIL is not pooled, obviously, when it's sent to the parishes. It goes direct to the parish councils. It's for them to decide how to spend the money. Within the unparished area, I suppose you could argue that it's pooled, but it's to be spent within those 9 unparished wards. But the phrase pooling really relates to strategic SIL, which has to meet the infrastructure definition in the 2008 Planning Act. All other SIL, neighbourhood, whether it's to a parish or within the unparished wards, it's back to that point. Anything else that addresses the demand that development places on the area.
I'll let Councillor Highlands come back on that, and I'll go to Councillor Steele.
Thank you, Officer, for that. But if you look at page 13, 1.6, where, and I know we've been interchanging words here, national policy, guidance, but I think we're all talking about SIL regulations 59A, right? The SIL regulations do not state what should happen to any surplus neighbourhood allocation once that £100 per council tax dwelling has been reached. The council has some discretion, and what we're saying is you're misusing your discretion at this point.
Councillor Steele, and then... Oh, do you want to come back? Okay, Mr Brooks.
Yeah, on Councillor Highland's point, the purpose of this report that went to Cabinet was to set a policy so we could spend that SIL cap, and it set out in what way that SIL cap was going to be spent. So that is a formal policy to spend that SIL cap that couldn't be spent in a parish because there was, as Mr Graham said, the SIL regulations are quite on that point. So the council have implemented a policy that is legally correct to allow them to spend that money. So I disagree with your point, Councillor Highland.
Councillor Steele.
I'm going to try and draw it to a conclusion, if I may. And I welcome the offer from Councillor Robinson. I would love to have a discussion about extending the cycle route from Goulton Road through to the new development. It seems to me, and this is trying to draw it to a conclusion, that the words as written in the Cabinet stated policy don't exactly line up with what's been said about vicinity and national policy, and that at the very least we ought to be asking the Cabinet to reword that policy, and so because it's in danger of actually contradicting the national policy. So in the first instance, I think I would certainly, if we get to the point of making a recommendation, that we send the policy statement in 9.1 back to the Cabinet for redefinition to align with national policy and to align with exactly what they say. And if it needs to be, and if if it needs to be adjacent and impacted rather than adjacent or impacted, then let it say that. The second thing on any recommendation, I certainly would like to see some evidence or have some view of how adjoining parishes or wards can be considered if they think there is an impact from that particular build. And as I say, I welcome a discussion about continuing the cycle route down Hollow Lane and joining up to the new estate. So my proposal for a recommendation would be to send the policy back for better definition and to also come back with a way that adjoining parishes can be considered in any future uncapped SIL, because it is neighbourhood SIL we're talking about. It is not strategic SIL, it is neighbourhood, and I've never drifted away from talking about neighbourhood SIL. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Before we close and I go put that to the meeting, is there anybody else that wants to add to the debate that's taken place? And I know it has gone on and we've gone back and forth, but I think that rather illustrates the fact that there is different understandings of what was on the table, and therefore I think it might be useful to clarify this further. And the discussion about taking things prior to rather than, because this is quite a complex subject with many different aspects to it. And I think in terms of the policy and what it's meant to do, it's supposed to benefit the local communities where there's building. It benefits the council as well, being able to fund worthwhile projects that it has in line with the capital spend. So has anyone else got... Councillor Robinson.
I mean, an awful lot of suggestions and have been made, all of which may be perfectly valid and worth talking about. So, for example, we talked about this in the Corporate Peer Challenge review, that actually that the function of the policy board is to look at policy, and that the function of scrutiny is to scrutinise decisions. And I think that's quite a helpful distinction, that scrutiny, like today, is scrutinising a decision after it's been taken to check whether it's valid. Fundamentally, although lots has been said in the last hour and 7 minutes, the policy change was to give the council permission to spend the SIL cap money on its own, on city council projects, which under the current policy it's not allowed to do. That's the only thing that has changed in this policy. We don't need to go over yet again all the words that are used, but because what the policy says, it says explicitly that the policy change is to allow the council to spend the money on its own projects. That's the only change.
I think we might agree to differ in terms of how clear it is.
Well, it uses the words that exist. The problem is the existing words may not have been very clear.
Well,
let's clear those up. But those are the hangover from the past.
Well, yeah, no, we're not in a blame game here about whose fault it is. We're saying here we are sitting here and we have ambiguity.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is not blame anyone. We're trying to find a way where we make it very clear so that in the future the public and councillors are clear about what the money can be spent on where, and there is that transparency that gives us reassurance that there are decisions being made for the right reasons. I'm not saying they're not now, but it just makes that part of it a lot clearer.
Yeah.
So
I think can I just one final bit? I think, as Mr. Graham was saying, I think he's tried to cover all eventualities, and in doing so we've ended up with some wording which may be less than clear, because he was trying to, because this is a really, really sort of, they always say that edge cases make bad law, that this is a really odd situation where we've got a small parish next to a big unparished area, and that's where this has come from. But in order that we don't just set a policy that is only about the Chignalls, the paper was drafted slightly more broadly than that. And that was where the confusion has crept in. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is the words in the vicinity are in the national regulations, and that's the thing that we have to comply with more than anything else.
Thank you for that. Is there any other comment before I go to Councillor.
It's just given Councillor Thompson's suggestion earlier about an informed debate and how complex the topic is, I wonder whether it might be worth agreeing with the Cabinet decision, given the commitment to be as open about it as possible, and that we come back to it later to discuss how we'd like to suggest that we make amendments to the policy in the future. So in the meantime, we can make those decisions that the Cabinet is ultimately trying to do, while having also the opportunity to think about it and say, this is what we'd like to suggest to how we manage this kind of thing in the future.
Anybody else got any comments on that? My personal view is, if you're going to change something, you change it once and you do it properly so that everyone understands. If you change it once and change it again, it becomes even more confusing. So I think I would like to put forward the motion that Councillor Steele has suggested. The first is that we take the policy and we look at the areas that appear to be ambiguous and try to make this less confusing, and come back with a policy that is adapted accordingly. And that, again, is not a criticism of you, Mr. Graham. It's about whether we can iron out the things that have come in this meeting today and the way that that has been interpreted. I particularly make reference to, you have to read it in conjunction with the guidance. I know that, but I think the guidance should be integrated into that policy so that it stands alone and is guided by the policy. And I think there was a second part to that, which is about...
Well, I think it kind of, I mean, I've written something out, but I think whatever the policy is, I think I'd like to then understand that would then bring forward an understanding and evidence of the application of that policy in a fair way. So if the policy does allow, in the general case, adjoining parishes and wards, that there is some view of the process where adjoining parish and wards are involved. So the first part was to clarify the policy and to make sure it aligns with national policy, and the second was, whatever the policy then says, to make sure that there is a process in place where such adjoining parishes can take part in that. It may be that if you rewrite the policy to say we're not considering adjoining parishes, then the second part doesn't apply, but I don't think you'll do that.
What I'm going to do is ask the first question first, which is, we need to have a show of hands on this, a vote on this to take this forward. We are suggesting an alteration to the policy so that it can be clarified and considered in line with the national policy as described by Councillor Steele. Can I have a show of hands? That means taking that back, saying we defer the decision until that's been further clarified. Can I have a show of hands on who supports that course of action? Well, the second part then becomes, I think, yeah.
Just go for for and against.
Can I have against? Thank you. In which case, I can't see that we can add to what's gone on. Councillor Steele.
Can I say that's an amazing result, given that Councillor Robinson actually did volunteer to clarify the policy. I'm gobsmacked that you have not even aligned with your own leader.
They don't get to... That doesn't work like that. But I thought Councillor Franks' suggestion was helpful, saying Cabinet should implement its decision and then we'll look at the policy. Happy to work with you.
Councillor Steele, can I just say that Councillor Robinson said he would meet with you to clarify the policy, and if those of us that are happy can vote the way that we want to vote. Thank you.
I think actually what was said was he didn't think it was necessary at the end of saying that we could do that, but there's a difference of opinion. We'll get that on the tape now. I hope it's still working, because it didn't work last time. Councillor Highlands.
Well, I'm hoping no councillor gets preferential treatment. We should all be given the information that is required to make sure we understand.
Councillor.
Just in accordance with the options presented to the committee, I think we have to propose that we agreed to the proposed changes by Cabinet. So can we do that?
I think what
because
you're
we've
saying
voted
is,
it down, we need to decide what we are suggesting to Cabinet. So.
well, we have to go back to the recommendations at the
Yes.
beginning of the meeting, which
Yeah.
is that we accept the document as it stands and that it goes in as policy, despite the debate that we've had here tonight. So a show of hands for that then, please. And against? Obviously carried, then the decision at Cabinet stands. Thank you. And I call the meeting to a close, and thank you very much for your attendance and your interest and contributions. Thank you.